Commander Veltas stood in his office overlooking the training grounds of the Galactic Concordant Military Academy. His forearms were crossed behind his back as he watched cadets practice their formations below. Everything moved with precision and grace. This was how war should be conducted, he thought. With honor, discipline, and respect for ancient traditions, the Academy had stood on Threshold Prime for over 2,000 years. Its marble halls had produced the greatest military minds in the galaxy. Officers from 12 different species learned the art of warfare here. Not the brutal, savage warfare of primitive times, but civilized combat. War with rules, war with meaning. Veltas turned from the window as his communication panel chimed. The Academy Board wanted to speak with him about the upcoming grand exercise. He answered immediately. Commander Veltas. The board chairman's voice crackled through the speaker. We have an unusual request for this year's exercise week. We believe it would be valuable to invite a guest lecturer, someone from an outside perspective. Veltas felt his secondary arms twitch with curiosity. What species did you have in mind, Chairman? Human. We want to invite a human military instructor. The word hung in the air. Humans. The newcomers. They had joined the Concordat only 300 years ago. In galactic terms, they were children. Their military history was filled with chaos and bloodshed. They fought wars without honor, without rules, yet somehow they had survived and even thrived, that is, unexpected, Veltas said carefully. May I ask the reasoning? Cultural exchange, Commander. Our cadets should understand how different species approach warfare. The humans have a unique perspective. It will be educational. Veltas agreed, though he felt uncertain. 2 weeks later, he found himself at the spaceport waiting for the human to arrive. He had reviewed her file. Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Chen, 20 years of service in the Terran Colonial Marines, combat experience on 4 different worlds, age 41 by human counting. The photograph showed a woman with dark hair pulled back tightly, dark eyes that seemed to look through the camera, and a face that revealed nothing. The diplomatic shuttle touched down with barely a whisper. The door opened and Gunnery Sergeant Chen stepped out. She was shorter than Veltas had expected. Most species in the Concordat stood between 7 and 8 feet tall. Chen was perhaps 5.5 feet. She wore her uniform perfectly, moved with easy confidence, and carried a single bag over her shoulder. Commander Veltas, she extended her hand in the human greeting. Gunnery Sergeant Sarah Chen, Terran Colonial Marines. Thank you for the invitation. Veltas gripped her hand carefully with one of his larger hands. Her grip was firm despite her size. Welcome to Threshold Prime, Sergeant Chen. We are honored to have you. As they walked through the academy grounds, Chen looked around with interest. Cadets in training stopped to stare at the human. She was smaller than all of them, and clearly unaugmented. No visible weapons, no armor enhancements, just a human woman in a plain uniform. Your academy is beautiful, Chen said. How old is it? Over 2,000 years, Veltas replied with pride. We have trained officers for 73 generations. Our methods have been refined across centuries. Impressive, Chen said, and she seemed to mean it. That evening, Veltas introduced Chen to the senior cadets who would attend her lecture. There was Saral, a brilliant Kresian with 4 arms like Veltas himself. There was Mira, a Veln whose species could see in spectrums humans could not. There was Protok Jr., nephew of a War Department official whose silver skin marked him as Talasian nobility. 120 of the best military students in the galaxy. They gathered in the grand lecture hall the next morning. Chen stood at the podium looking impossibly small. She did not seem nervous. Thank you for having me, she began. I'm going to talk about human military history. Some of what I say might be disturbing to you. I apologize in advance, but I believe honesty is more valuable than comfort. She activated the holographic display. Images filled the air above the cadets' heads. This is Earth in the year 1914 by our calendar. My species was about to fight something we called World War I. Over 17 million people died in 4 years. We used poison gas. We used machine guns on soldiers charging across open ground. We fought in trenches filled with mud and disease. There were no rules, no honor. Just survival. The cadets stirred uncomfortably. Veltas saw shock on their faces. Chen continued. The images changed. World War II. Nuclear weapons. The Cold War. Guerrilla warfare, terrorism, asymmetric combat. Each new concept seemed to disturb the cadets more. In concordate warfare, armies met on agreed battlefields. They used agreed weapons. They followed protocols established over millennia. Civilians were never targeted. Supply lines were not attacked. Deception was considered dishonorable. Humans did all of these things regularly. Why? A cadet finally asked. Why fight without honor? Chen looked at the young Cresian who had spoken. Because our enemies did not care about honor. Because if we followed rules and they did not, we died. On Earth, we had a saying, the enemy gets a vote. You can fight however you want. But if your enemy won't follow your rules, your honor becomes your grave. Silence filled the lecture hall. Chen spoke for 2 more hours. She explained human tactical doctrine. She discussed the concept of acceptable casualties. She described how humans had learned to fight on a death world where everything wanted to kill them. Where honor was a luxury and survival was everything. When the lecture ended, the cadets filed out quietly. Many looked troubled. Felthus approached Chen as she gathered her materials. That was educational, he said carefully. Chen smiled slightly. I imagine it was upsetting for them. Your species evolved past that kind of warfare. Mine never did. We're still fighting for survival even now. Do you not find that sad? Every day, Chen said quietly. Every single day. That evening, the Academy Commandant invited Chen to dinner. He was an elderly Velen named Sareth who had served for 50 years. Over the meal, he asked her many questions about human warfare. Chen answered honestly but without pride. You will observe our grand exercise tomorrow, Sareth said. It is the culmination of our senior cadets training. Perhaps you would like to participate in an advisory capacity. I would be honored, Chen replied. What neither Veltus nor Chen knew was that observers from the War Department had been present at her lecture. They had recorded everything, and they had already begun modifying the grand exercise parameters. In a secure facility far below the Academy, War Department officials reviewed the new scenario. It was based on real combat data from the frontier. A species called the Ravagers had been attacking colonies for 8 months. Over 17,000 concordate personnel had died. Traditional tactics had failed completely. The Ravagers did not follow any known rules of warfare. They targeted civilians first. They used panic as a weapon. They ignored all communication attempts. They seemed designed purely to create maximum death and chaos. The grand exercise would simulate a Ravager attack. The cadets would face an impossible scenario, and the War Department would watch carefully to see how the human reacted when concordate doctrine failed. They called it a cultural exchange. They called it a guest lecture. But in the classified reports, they called it what it really was. A live fire test of human tactical doctrine. The concordate needed answers. The Ravagers were winning, and humanity, with its brutal, honorless, survival-focused warfare, might be the only hope the galaxy had. Chen went to sleep that night unaware that she had been brought to Threshold Prime not to teach, but to be tested. The Academy had summoned a human marine for a guest lecture. The War Department had called it something else entirely. Tomorrow, everything would change. The grand exercise began at dawn. Chen stood in the observation deck high above the simulation chamber. The room was filled with Academy instructors and officers she did not recognize. Their uniforms marked them as War Department personnel. She wondered why so many high-ranking officials would attend a student exercise. Below, the simulation chamber had been transformed into a perfect replica of a space station. Space Station Tartarus, the briefing had called it. The holographic projections were so detailed that Chen could see individual rooms and corridors. Small figures representing the 120 cadets moved into position. Commander Velta stood beside her. The scenario is straightforward, he explained. The cadets must defend the station against an attacking force. The station holds 10,000 civilians. The cadets have 6 hours to repel the attack while minimizing casualties and maintaining station integrity. What are they facing? Chen asked. 50 combat drones programmed with unusual tactics, based on a real enemy we have encountered on the frontier. Veltus hesitated. They call themselves the Ravagers. Chen noticed how he said the name, like it tasted bad in his mouth. In the simulation chamber, Cadet Commander Soral stood in the central command station. He was a Cresian like Velthas, young and brilliant. He had graduated top of his class in tactical theory. Now he faced his final test. All units report status, Soral commanded. His voice was steady and confident. The reports came in quickly. Defense teams positioned at critical junctions, rapid response units ready to deploy, evacuation protocols prepared for civilians, communication arrays broadcasting on all frequencies ready to offer terms and negotiate with the attacking force. It was perfect. Textbook concordant military doctrine. Chen had seen similar defensive positions in human military academies. They would work well against an enemy who followed rules. The simulation timer began counting down. 6 hours. At 5 hours and 59 minutes, the attack began. 50 red dots appeared on the tactical display, representing the Ravager drones. Immediately, Soral opened communication channels. Unidentified vessels, this is Cadet Commander Soral of the Galactic Concordat. We request peaceful communication. Please state your intentions. Silence. The red dots accelerated toward the station. They ignored all hails. Continue broadcasting, Soral ordered. Prepare defensive positions but do not fire unless fired upon. Rules of engagement protocols remained in effect. Chen watched the red dots move. They were not heading for military targets. They were not approaching the defensive perimeters. Instead, they went straight for the civilian quarters, for the medical facilities, for the life support systems. The first explosions tore through the residential sectors. Simulated civilians began dying immediately. The casualty counter on the main display started climbing. 50 dead, 100. 200! Return fire! Sorrel commanded. All units engage. But the cadets could not get clear shots. The Ravager drones moved through the civilian areas, using the fleeing people as shields. When cadets tried to engage, they risked hitting civilians. Concordat doctrine was clear. Minimize collateral damage above all else. The drones knew this. They exploited it ruthlessly. Chen watched in silence as the simulation unfolded exactly as she expected. The cadets were brave and well-trained. They followed their doctrine perfectly, and they were losing badly. At 30 minutes, civilian casualties passed 3,000. Station integrity dropped to 70%. The cadets were being forced to abandon sections of the station as the drones systematically destroyed life support and structural systems. Soral was trying everything. He repositioned forces. He attempted to draw the drones into ambushes. He broadcast surrender terms, offering to negotiate. Nothing worked. The Ravagers were not interested in victory by Concordat standards. They wanted maximum death and maximum chaos. Beside Chen, Velta spoke quietly. This scenario has been run 4 times with actual military units on the frontier. All 4 times it ended with over 70% casualties. The cadets are performing exactly as expected. You mean they're failing exactly as expected, Chen said. Velthus looked at her sharply but said nothing. At 2 hours, the situation was desperate. Nearly 5,000 simulated civilians were dead. Station integrity was at 55% and falling. Entire sections were exposed to vacuum. The cadets were exhausted, frustrated, and watching their perfect defense fall apart. In the command center, Soral stared at the tactical display. His forearms hung limply at his sides. He had tried everything he knew, everything he had been taught. None of it worked. The Ravagers did not care about honor. They did not care about rules. They just killed and killed and killed, sir. One of his officers said quietly. We should begin full evacuation. If we surrender the station, we can save the remaining civilians. It was the correct decision by Concordat standards. Preserve life over strategic assets. Accept honorable defeat rather than senseless slaughter. Sorrel opened his mouth to give the order. With respect, Commandant. Chen's voice came from above. She was speaking into the observation deck communicator. May I have permission to speak with the cadet commander? The Academy Commandant looked at the War Department officials. One of them, a cold-eyed Talasian named Protok, nodded slightly. Permission granted. Chen descended to the simulation chamber. She walked through the holographic corridors until she reached the command center. The cadets stared at her. This small human woman who had taught them about wars without honor. Cadet Commander Soral, Chen said. May I speak with you privately? They stepped into a side room. Chen looked at the young Cresian. He was exhausted and defeated. She had seen that expression before on many faces. You're going to surrender, Chen said. It was not a question. Yes. It is the only way to save lives. The honorable choice. And in 3 months, when the Ravagers attack another station and another commander makes the same honorable choice, how many more people die? Soral said nothing. Chen stepped closer. Let me ask you something. Are you trying to win a war or pass a test? I don't understand. Those things out there. Chen pointed at the tactical display showing the Ravager drones. They're not warriors. They're not soldiers following some code of honor. They're predators. And predators don't care about your rules. They only understand one thing, becoming prey themselves. What are you suggesting? Chen looked into his eyes. Stop defending. Start attacking. Stop fighting fair. Start fighting to win. Your doctrine is beautiful. It's honorable. And against these enemies, it will get everyone you're supposed to protect killed. But the rules of engagement, the Ravagers aren't following them. Why should you? Chen's voice was hard now. You can have honor or you can have victory. Against enemies who want to kill you, you rarely get both. Choose which matters more. She left him there and returned to the observation deck. The War Department officials were watching her carefully. They silenced the audio feed to the command center. Whatever happened next would be the cadets' choice alone. In the command center, Soral stood frozen. Everything Chen said went against 4 years of training, against 2,000 years of concordant military tradition. But he looked at the casualty counter still climbing and made his decision. Cancel the evacuation, he commanded. His voice had changed. It was harder now, colder. His officers stared at him in shock. New orders, Soral continued. Forget the rules of engagement. Forget the protocols. These things want to kill us. We're going to kill them first, and we're going to make them regret coming here. On the observation deck, the instructors erupted in protests. This was against every principle they taught. The Academy Commandant moved to stop the exercise. Let it continue, Protok said quietly. The War Department official's voice carried absolute authority. This is exactly what we need to see. Soral reorganized his forces into 3 teams: hunters, shepherds, and ghosts. The terms meant nothing to concordant doctrine, but Chen recognized them. They were human concepts. The cadets were adapting. The hunters stopped defending choke points and started using the station's maintenance tunnels to ambush drones from behind. No warnings, no announcements. Just sudden, brutal attacks from unexpected angles. The shepherds created false civilian concentrations using heat generators and audio recordings. They led the drones into traps while moving real civilians through unpredictable routes the enemy could not anticipate. The ghosts, led by Soral himself, began psychological warfare. They disabled drones without destroying them, leaving the damaged machines to broadcast images of their own destruction. They created graveyards of broken drones at key intersections. They made the enemy afraid. It was vicious. It was dishonorable. It was working. The casualty counter slowed, then stopped climbing. Station integrity stabilized. The red dots on the tactical display began disappearing one by one. In the observation deck, Chen watched in silence. She felt no triumph, only the familiar weight of knowing what she had unleashed. The cadets were learning to fight like humans. They were learning to survive, but they were also learning to carry the weight that came with survival at any cost. The simulation continued, and the galaxy was about to learn what humanity had always known. Sometimes honor is a luxury the universe cannot afford. The simulation chamber had become a different kind of battlefield. The cadets no longer fought like concordant officers. They fought like survivors, and it was brutal to watch. Chen stood at the observation deck window, her face expressionless. Behind her, Academy instructors argued in heated whispers. Some demanded the simulation be stopped immediately. Others watched in horrified fascination. The War Department officials remained silent, recording everything. On the tactical display, the hunter teams moved through the maintenance tunnels like ghosts. A group of 4 cadets appeared behind a Ravager drone that was targeting a medical station. The drone's sensors were focused forward, expecting enemies to announce themselves to follow engagement protocols. Instead, the cadets hit it from behind with maintenance tools turned into weapons. The drone never knew they were there. Commander Velthos watched one of his best students, a young Vel named Mira, coordinate an ambush using the station's ventilation system. She had always been top of her class in tactical theory. Now she crouched in a narrow duct, directing her team with hand signals instead of radio communications. When 3 drones passed beneath them, the cadets dropped down behind them and attacked before the machines could turn around. "This is disgraceful," one instructor muttered. "They're fighting like criminals. They're fighting like humans." Another responded quietly. In the central command center, Saral coordinated his forces with cold efficiency. Gone was the honorable cadet who had offered surrender terms. In his place stood something harder. He watched the tactical display and made decisions that would have been unthinkable 3 hours ago. Shepard Team 3, create false thermal signatures in Sector 7. Make it look like 200 civilians are sheltering there. Ghost Team 2, once the drones moved to engage, collapse the corridor behind them. Trap them in. It was a trap that would work because the Ravagers expected victims, not predators. The drones moved into Sector 7 following what appeared to be fleeing civilians. The corridor behind them exploded, sealed by carefully placed charges from the station's mining equipment. The drones were trapped in a dead-end section. Hunter teams moved in for the kill. The casualty counter had stopped at 6,200. For the past hour, not a single additional civilian had died. The Shepards were moving the real civilians through routes the drones could not predict, using deception and misdirection, instead of announced evacuation protocols. One of the Shepard teams was led by a Krasian cadet named Vex. He had painted false blood on his uniform and was pretending to be a wounded civilian, limping through a corridor. His team hid in side rooms. When 3 Ravager drones followed what they thought was easy prey, the team erupted from cover. They used improvised electromagnetic pulse devices built from station equipment. The drones dropped, disabled. The team moved on without a word. Chen watched this particular tactic with a tight feeling in her chest. She had seen human soldiers do the same thing on frontier worlds. Use themselves as bait, accept the risk. Do whatever it took to win. It worked. But it also left scars that never healed. At Hour 4, the Ghost teams began their psychological campaign in earnest. Sorrel had divided them into small groups that moved through areas the drones had already cleared. They found disabled but functional drones and did things that made Chen close her eyes. Briefly, one team welded damaged drones to walls in grotesque positions. Another team used station speakers to broadcast tactical data about drone positions, making the enemy predictable. A third team created a display in a main corridor, 15 destroyed drones arranged in a pattern, with lights positioned to make their shadows look like reaching hands. It was psychological warfare. It was meant to create fear and uncertainty. The Ravager drones were sophisticated machines, but they shared tactical data with each other. When they transmitted images of their destroyed companions, it affected their predictive algorithms. They began moving more cautiously, more predictably. "This is monstrous," an instructor said loudly. "We should stop this immediately. They're desecrating the enemy." Protok, the War Department official, finally spoke. "The enemy that has killed 17,000 of our people in 8 months? That enemy?" His voice was cold. "Let it continue." At Hour 5, the tide had completely turned. The simulation's automated systems were struggling to adapt. The Ravager drones were programmed to fight honorable opponents who followed predictable patterns. Instead, they faced enemies who appeared from nowhere, used deception, sacrificed honor for effectiveness, and made every section of the station a death trap. A hunter team led by Cadet Mira had learned to use the station's magnetic cargo systems. They would activate the magnets when drones passed underneath, pinning them in place. Then they would drop improvised explosives from above. It was efficient and brutal. Another team discovered that the station's fire suppression system could be weaponized. They lured drones into sealed sections, then flooded the rooms with suppressant foam. The drones' sensors were blinded. Their movement was restricted. They became easy targets. Chen noticed something that made her professionally impressed despite her reservations. The cadets were learning in real time. They were adapting faster than she expected. They shared successful tactics instantly. When one team discovered something that worked, every other team implemented it within minutes. It was the kind of battlefield evolution that took human units months to develop, but there was a cost. She could see it even through the simulation. A Velen cadet named Sira sat against a wall after her team successfully defended a civilian shelter. She had done it by using children's toys as decoys, making the drones waste ammunition on false targets. It worked perfectly. She had saved 200 lives, and she was crying silently, her head in her hands. Another cadet, a Talasian named Krex, had led his team in a brutal close-quarters ambush. They had torn 3 drones apart with mining equipment. It was savage and effective. Now Krek stared at his hands, which were shaking uncontrollably. They were winning, but they were also breaking. These were students who had been raised on honor and dignity. Now they were learning that survival required neither. At hour 5 and 40 minutes, only 8 Ravager drones remained operational. Station integrity was at 58%. Civilian casualties had stabilized at 6,472. By concordant historical standards against Ravagers, it was a miracle. By human standards, it was still a tragedy. In the observation deck, the Academy Commandant stood with his arms crossed. His face was unreadable. Vel'Thas stood beside him, watching his students become something else. Something harder. "They're going to win," Vel'Thas said quietly. "They're actually going to win an unwinnable scenario." "At what cost?" The Commandant replied. Chen heard the exchange. She turned to face them. "The cost is knowing that you can do terrible things for good reasons. The cost is carrying that weight for the rest of your lives. The cost is looking in the mirror and wondering if you're still the person you thought you were." She paused. "That's the price humanity pays for survival. Now your cadets are learning to pay it too." At hour 6, the simulation ended. The final statistics appeared on the main display. Civilian casualties, 6,503. Station integrity, 58%. Enemy forces completely eliminated. Mission status, victory. The command center erupted in exhausted cheers. The cadets had done the impossible. They had won a scenario that had defeated actual military units 4 times before. But the celebration was muted. Strange. The cadets looked at each other with expressions that mixed triumph and shame. They had won, but not the way they had been taught to win. They had abandoned every principle they had spent 4 years learning. Soral stood in the center of the command room, staring at the victory statistics. He should have felt proud. Instead, he felt empty, dirty, like he had betrayed something important that he could never get back. In the observation deck, the Academy instructors were silent. Some looked angry. Some looked thoughtful. All of them looked troubled. Protok, the War Department official, smiled slightly. It was not a warm smile. "That," he said quietly, "was exactly what we needed to see." Chen understood then, completely and finally. This had never been about cultural exchange. It had never been about giving cadets a broader perspective. The War Department had orchestrated this from the beginning. They had designed an impossible scenario based on real enemy tactics. They had brought in a human to see if concordant forces could learn to fight without honor. And they had proven that yes, they could, but proving they could do it was not the same as proving they should do it. The cadets filed out of the simulation chamber slowly. They did not march with their usual pride. They moved like soldiers after a real battle, tired, changed, carrying invisible wounds that would never completely heal. Vel'Thas approached Chen in the observation deck. "You taught them to win," he said. It was not quite an accusation, not quite a compliment. "I taught them to survive," Chen corrected. "Winning and surviving are not always the same thing." "Then what did they win?" Chen looked at the empty simulation chamber. "Time. They bought time for those 6,000 people who would have died. Whether that's worth what they lost of themselves, that's something each of them will have to decide." She walked away, leaving Vel'Thas standing alone. She needed air. She knew the morning after the grand exercise, the Academy felt different. Chen walked through the corridors and noticed how the cadets moved. They were quieter now, less certain. They had always carried themselves with pride before, but now there was something else in their bearing, something heavier. She found Cadet Commander Soral in one of the study halls sitting alone. His forearms were folded on the table in front of him. He did not look up when she approached. "May I sit?" Chen asked. He nodded silently. They sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Soral spoke. "I have been summoned to give my after-action report this afternoon. To the Academy Commandant, the instructors, and the War Department officials. What will you tell them?" "The truth." He looked at her with haunted eyes. "We won because we stopped being concordant officers and started being something else. We used deception. We used civilians as bait. We treated the enemy with cruelty. We abandoned every principle we were taught to value." He paused. "If this was a real engagement, I don't know if I would deserve commendation or court-martial." Chen understood that feeling. Both probably. That's the nature of this kind of warfare. You do terrible things for good reasons, and both the terrible and the good are equally true. How do you live with it? It was the question Chen had been asked 100 times by young soldiers. She never had a good answer. Honestly, some days you don't. Some days you just get through the hours until you can sleep, and then you wake up and do it again. She met his eyes. But you remember why you did it? Those 6,000 people who would have died if you fought honorably? They're alive because you made hard choices. That has to count for something. Does it count enough? I don't know, Chen said honestly. I've been asking myself that question for 20 years. In another part of the academy, Commander Veltha stood in the commandant's office. Several instructors were present and the argument had been going on for an hour. We must reprimand the cadets, one instructor insisted. They violated every regulation. They abandoned honor protocols. If we allow this to stand, we destroy everything the academy represents. They completed an impossible mission. Another countered. They saved thousands of lives in a scenario where everyone else failed. Are we really going to punish success? The commandant, old Sareth, raised his hand for silence. The real question is not whether we punish or reward them. The question is what this means for our military doctrine going forward. Veltha spoke carefully. I have taught honor and dignity for 40 years. I believe that civilized warfare was the highest achievement of our species. But yesterday, I watched students win by abandoning everything I taught them, and I cannot deny that their methods saved lives. Their methods were barbaric, an instructor protested. Yes, Velthas agreed, and effective. That is the problem. In a secure conference room deep in the War Department facility, Protok reviewed the simulation data with his colleagues. Every moment had been recorded. Every tactical decision had been analyzed. The results were exactly what they had hoped for and feared. The cadets adapted to human tactical doctrine faster than projected, one analyst reported. With proper training, Concordat forces could implement these methods across the fleet. At what cost to unit cohesion and morale? Another asked. These are not just tactics. They represent a fundamental shift in military philosophy. Our forces are trained to value honor above all else. If we tell them to abandon that, Protok cut him off. If we don't, the Ravagers will continue killing thousands. We've lost 17,000 personnel in 8 months using traditional methods. Yesterday, untrained students achieved better results using human methods. The choice is clear. Is it? The question came from an older Talesian officer. We change our entire military culture because of one simulation? We abandon 3,000 years of tradition? Tradition, Protok said coldly, means nothing to the dead. Chen spent the afternoon walking the academy grounds trying to clear her head. She found a small garden overlooking a valley and sat on a bench. She was not alone for long. Velthas found her there. May I join you? He asked. Chen nodded to the bench beside her. They sat in silence for a while, watching the valley below. Finally, Velthas spoke. I need to understand something. Your species has been fighting this way for how long? As long as we've kept records. Thousands of years, probably longer. And you never evolved past it? Never found a better way? Chen considered the question. We tried. Many times, we had periods of peace, periods of civilization, periods where we thought we had moved beyond savage warfare, and then we would encounter an enemy that didn't care about our rules, and we would remember that survival comes first. That seems like a terrible way to live. It is, Chen agreed. But we're from a death world, Commander. Earth tried to kill us for millions of years. Everything on our planet was trying to eat us or poison us or crush us. We learned to fight dirty because the universe doesn't care about honor. It only cares about what survives. Velthas was quiet for a moment. The Concordat species never had that experience. We evolved on gentler worlds. We developed honor systems because we could afford to. Because our enemies were like us and we could agree on rules. And now you've met an enemy that didn't get the message about rules. The Ravagers, Velthas said quietly. They're unlike anything we've encountered before. They don't communicate. They don't negotiate. They just kill. Everything, everyone. Without purpose or pattern we can understand. Then you need to decide something, Chen said. Are you fighting to preserve your honor, or are you fighting to survive? Because against enemies like the Ravagers, you probably can't have both. If we become like them, if we abandon everything that makes us civilized, do we even deserve to survive? It was the question that haunted every ethical discussion of warfare. Chen had heard it before. That's the razor's edge that every soldier walks. You can use brutal methods for good reasons and still come home broken. You can be effective and ethical, but it requires constant self-examination. She looked at him directly. The real danger isn't becoming monsters. It's thinking the methods don't change you. They do, every time. You have to decide if survival is worth that price. That afternoon, Sorrel delivered his report to the assembled officials. He stood at attention in the Great Hall and spoke clearly without excuses. We won the exercise by abandoning concordant military doctrine. We used deception, ambush, psychological warfare, and accepted civilian casualties as metrics rather than red lines. We treated the enemy with cruelty. We became something other than concordant officers. He paused. But 6,000 people who would have died are alive. I don't know if that justifies our methods. I only know that those people are alive. The room was silent when he finished. The Academy Commandant stood. Thank you, Cadet Commander. You are dismissed. After Sorrel left, the debate began again. It continued for hours. Some officials wanted the results classified and forgotten. Others wanted the tactics studied and implemented. The Academy instructors were split. The War Department officials were insistent. Finally, the Commandant made his decision. The grand exercise results will be classified. The cadets will receive neither commendation nor punishment. What they did was necessary but not praiseworthy. However, he paused, looking at the War Department officials. I am recommending to the Concordant High Council that we formally request human military advisors for the Ravager conflict. We need guidance on how to implement these tactics without losing our souls in the process. Protok smiled slightly. This was exactly what the War Department had wanted. The test had been successful. That evening, Chen found herself surrounded by cadets. They had sought her out, needing to talk to someone who understood what they were feeling. They sat in a quiet courtyard, these young officers from a dozen different species, all looking at her with the same expression: confusion, guilt, and the desperate need for answers. Does it get easier? One asked. Chen shook her head. No. If it gets easier, that means you've stopped caring. And if you stop caring, you've lost something important. Then how do we do this? Sorrel asked. How do we use these methods and remain ourselves? Chen thought carefully before answering. You remember why you're doing it. Every decision, every compromise, you ask yourself, is this necessary to save lives? Not to win. Not to look good. To save lives. If the answer is yes, you do it and you carry the weight. If the answer is no, you don't do it no matter how much easier it would make things. And if we make mistakes? You will, Chen said quietly. We all do. That's part of the price. You make the best choice you can with the information you have, and sometimes it's still the wrong choice. You live with that. You learn from it. And you try to do better next time. A young Valn cadet, Mira, spoke up. Sergeant Chen, what you've taught us. It works, but it feels wrong. Everything in me says these methods are dishonorable. They are, Chen agreed. By your standards, they absolutely are. But honor is a luxury that requires both sides to agree to it, when only one side fall. 3 weeks had passed since the grand exercise. Chen was preparing to return to Earth when the emergency transmission came through. She was in her quarters at the Academy's guest facility when Commander Velthas appeared at her door, his face grim. There's a situation, he said without preamble. Ravager attack. Mining colony called Kepler's Reach. Population 45,000, including 3,000 concordant military personnel. Chen felt her stomach tighten. When? They'll arrive in 4 hours. The garrison commander has already begun evacuation protocols, but there aren't enough ships. At least 15,000 colonists will still be on the surface when the Ravagers arrive. What about reinforcements? Velthas shook his head. Too far. The nearest battle group is 6 hours away. Kepler's Reach will be alone. Chen understood immediately. You want me to go there. Not me. Velthas stepped aside and Protok entered the room. The War Department official looked like he had not slept. Your theories worked in simulation, Sergeant Chen. We need to know if they work in reality. A shuttle is fueled and waiting. We can have you at Kepler's Reach in 90 minutes. Chen looked at him hard. I'm a gunnery sergeant, not a strategic advisor. You need a human general for this, not an NCO. We need someone who can teach frightened defenders to survive in 90 minutes, Protok said bluntly. That's not a general's job. That's a sergeant's job, and you're the best sergeant we have available. Chen wanted to refuse. This was not her war. not her responsibility. But she thought about 15,000 civilians and made her decision. I'll go, but I want the cadets from the grand exercise to come with me, all of them who volunteer. Absolutely not, Velta said immediately. They're students, not soldiers. They're the only Concordat personnel who've actually trained in these tactics, Chen countered. Every second I waste explaining basic concepts to the garrison is time we don't have. The cadets already understand. They can help spread the knowledge faster. Protok overrode Veltas. Make the offer to the cadets. Anyone who volunteers can go. 20 minutes later, 15 cadets stood in the shuttle bay. Sorel was there, along with Mira, Vex, and others who had performed well in the simulation. They wore combat gear and looked terrified and determined in equal measure. You understand what you're volunteering for? Chen asked them. This isn't a simulation. Real people will die. Some of them might be you. We understand, Sorel said. If the simulation was preparation for anything, it was for this. We need to know if what we learned actually matters. The flight to Kepler's Reach took 90 minutes of tense silence. Chen used the time to review the colony's schematics and defensive positions. It was bad. The colony was built around deep mine shafts with housing and facilities scattered across a wide area. Difficult to defend, easy to attack, the garrison commander had positioned forces in a textbook defensive perimeter around the spaceport. Chen saw disaster written in every tactical decision. They landed to chaos. Civilians were flooding toward the spaceport in panic. Ships were launching as fast as they could be loaded. The garrison troops looked overwhelmed and frightened. This was what real war looked like when doctrine failed. Chen found the garrison commander, a middle-aged Cresian named Colonel Thex. He had the bearing of a career officer who had followed regulations his entire life. He looked at Chen with barely concealed annoyance. You're the human advisor. He made it sound like an insult. I've read the report about your simulation. War games and reality are different, Sergeant. Colonel, the Ravagers have killed 17,000 Concordat personnel in 8 months. How many of those were following traditional doctrine? All of them. And they died with honor. Chen kept her voice level. They died. That's the only part that matters to the civilians depending on them. Thex's face hardened. I will not abandon 3,000 years of military tradition based on one unorthodox exercise. My forces are positioned to provide maximum protection to the evacuation. We will hold as long as possible and withdraw in good order if necessary. And when the Ravagers ignore your defensive lines and go straight for the civilians, then we will respond according to doctrine. Chen knew this argument was going nowhere. Thex was not a bad officer. He was just an officer, trained for a kind of war that no longer existed. Colonel, I respect your command. The cadets and I will position ourselves as observers only. It was a lie. Once they were dismissed, Chen gathered the cadets in a storage facility away from the command center. We can't take command, but we can make suggestions to individual unit leaders. Find the junior officers, the ones who've seen combat. Tell them what we did in the simulation. Give them options. It's their choice whether to use them. The cadets spread through the garrison. They found sergeants and lieutenants, the junior officers who had watched friends die following doctrine that did not work. These veterans listened when the cadets described the grand exercise. They listened because they were desperate for anything that might work. Chen moved through the civilian areas, talking to the colony administrators. She explained how to use the mine shafts as shelters instead of the surface evacuation points. She showed them how to create false thermal signatures using industrial equipment. She was not giving orders. She was suggesting. But her suggestions were being implemented. 2 hours before the Ravagers arrived, the colony's defense looked different. On paper, it still followed Colonel Thex's plan. But underneath the official structure, small teams of soldiers were positioning themselves in unexpected places. Civilians were being quietly redirected to defensible positions. Mining equipment was being moved into tactical positions. Then the Ravagers came. 3 cruisers dropped from orbit and began launching assault pods. Chen watched from a high vantage point as the attack began exactly as she expected. The Ravagers ignored the military defensive lines and went straight for the civilian concentrations. Except the civilian concentrations they targeted were decoys. Thermal generators and audio equipment created the illusion of thousands of people in exposed locations. The real civilians were deep in the mine shafts, protected by rock and automated defenses. When the Ravager troops reached the empty decoys, they found something else: ambushes. Soldiers who had ignored Colonel Thex's deployment orders waited in concealed positions. Mining charges detonated. Heavy industrial equipment became improvised weapons. The Ravagers had expected easy prey. Instead, they met coordinated resistance from unexpected angles. In the command center, Colonel Thex watched his carefully planned defense fall apart. Units were not where they were supposed to be. Engagement protocols were being ignored. His officers were fighting like barbarians, and it was working. Casualties were mounting, but they were combat casualties, not massacres. The Ravagers were being damaged and destroyed faster than he had thought possible. Civilians were surviving in numbers that defied his projections. Thex made his decision. He opened a direct channel to Chen. "Sergeant, tell me what to do. I'll follow your lead." Chen felt no triumph, only grim necessity. "Stop trying to defend everything. Defend what matters. Use the terrain. Make every approach cost them. And forget about fighting fair. They're not." With Thex's authorization, the defense became coordinated. Soldiers stopped holding meaningless positions and started mobile warfare through the colony's industrial areas. They used ore processors as fortifications. They collapsed mine entrances to funnel Ravagers into kill zones. They used the colony's heavy machinery as weapons. The cadets fought alongside the regular troops, demonstrating the tactics they had learned. Sora led a team that used mining drones as remote explosives. Mira coordinated ambushes from elevated positions. Vex organized civilian volunteers to maintain supply lines through the mine tunnels. It was brutal and desperate and barely controlled chaos. But it was working. Chen moved through the battlefield, coordinating where she could, advising where she was needed. She saw a young Talasian soldier freeze when faced with a Ravager at close range. She saw a Valen officer make a split-second decision to sacrifice a defensive position to save civilians. She saw the cadets she had taught implementing lessons they had only practiced in simulation, their faces tight with fear and determination. The battle lasted 4 hours. When the Ravagers finally withdrew, leaving 40% of their force destroyed, the colony was still standing. The casualties were terrible by Concordat standards: 412 colonists dead, 276 military personnel lost. But by the standards of previous Ravager attacks, it was a miracle. Previous engagements had seen 60 to 70% casualties. Kepler's Reach had survived with just over 2% losses. Chen walked through the aftermath in a daze. Medical teams worked on the wounded. Soldiers sat exhausted among the ruins. Civilians emerged from the mines, shaken but alive. She saw Colonel Thex directing recovery operations, his face haggard but determined. She found Soral sitting against a wall, his uniform torn and dirty. He looked up at her with eyes that had aged 10 years in 4 hours. "We did it," he said. "We actually did it." "Yes," Chen agreed. She sat down beside him. "How do you feel?"